What's going on, everybody? Sean Daniel from Guitar Control here, and today you're going to learn how to dominate your guitar with the power of 7 chords, specifically dominant 7 chords. So make sure to click the tab sheet below with the link provided under this video, because we're going to go through what these 7 chords are, 7th chords are, where they are, and how to use them in a musical context. So basically, dominant 7 chord. If you've ever seen like a G7 or a C7, something looks like this or this. What that means is actually shorthand for G dominant 7, and we're going to talk about why it is so dominant. But first of all, just the theory behind it. All it is, it's a major chord with what's called a flattened 7th note. So if we take the G major scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. To make a G major chord, you take the first note, the third note, and the 5th note. If we want to make this dominant, if we want to start dominating, we find the 7th note in that scale. Right now I'm on the 4th fret of the D string, and we flatten it. Okay? So just by making that one small adjustment, we open up a whole world of domination. So if we were to arpeggiate, play the chord one note at a time, we'd get a 1, a 3, a 5, and a flat 7. So, it kind of sounds very bluesy once you play them together. Now, what we're going to do first is learn a couple of chord voicings and show how to add that 7th interval, that flat 7 interval, into chords that you probably already know. And then we're going to talk about kind of where you would use this type of thing. So we're going to stick with G because I think it's one of the most, probably the easiest 7 chord you've ever seen. In a G7, you can play just like this. You play the bottom 4 strings and just hold down that first note on the E string, an F. So it's a G chord, but with an F added. Okay? Now, another way to look at this is if you have a G note right here. Here's the root note. The 7 chord, the flat 7, is always going to be 2 frets lower than your root note. So remember, we added an F to a G chord. Now, you can actually play it like this. It's kind of like an interesting voicing because the F would be in the bass note. But again, most people, I would say, would play a G7 like this or like this. And the great thing about this is we can really easily turn this into a movable shape. And I think the way to remember this is just kind of like how we said before. 2 notes below the root note is where that 7th interval exists. Now if you think of a G on the high E string is the 3rd fret. So we can easily find that just by going to the 1st fret and getting the bottom 4 strings. Now this is a really good way to think about using it as a movable shape, because this right here isn't so movable. That sounds really bad once you start moving that around. But if we take just the bottom 4 strings, we can bar probably the bottom of it and start moving this around. And it's really easy to conceptualize as far as where this would go. You just find a root note on your high E string, which is a great thing to do to start maybe memorizing the names of some of these notes, like E, F, F sharp G, G sharp A sharp B, C, C sharp D, D sharp E, and then moving around. So if you wanted to play a D sharp 7, a D sharp dominant 7, you'd find a D sharp, which is the 11th fret, and then go 2 frets back, and then kind of bar it. And then you end up getting this G7 shape, but you can use it anywhere. In fact, we can even take the next octave of this by just tracking all the way down here. And what you want to learn how to do is to kind of start combining these with the root note of the key that you're in. So before we learn a couple more voicings, I want to talk a little bit about where you find dominant 7 chords used. So they exist only on, technically speaking, only on the 5 chord in any key. So the reason you might see a G7 a lot of the time is because the key of C major is a very popular key. So in the key of C major, C, D, E, F, G, that 5th note is a G. So the most obvious place to put a 7 chord, a dominant 7 chord, is going to be on the 5th note of any scale. And the reason that this happens is because this 5 chord resolves on the 1 chord. And I know sometimes like the numbers can be kind of confusing if you haven't talked about it, like the 7 chord is the 5 chord of the 1 chord, stuff like that. But basically remember that the 7 in a dominant 7 comes from the note that you add from the major scale, which is a flat 7, like we talked about before. So once you add that flat 7 interval, the dominant 7 interval, to the 5 chord, it's going to create like a tension that needs to be resolved by the 1 chord. So in a lot of, I would almost say in like at least 75% of the time that you see a dominant 7 chord, the very next chord after that will be the 1 chord. So it's kind of like a good way to start working through keys and finding out which chords sit on which numbers of a key just by thinking in terms of dominant 7 chords, because they create such an atmosphere of a kind of tension that needs to be released, right? So like another really popular one is D7. Right, you may have already learned this voicing before. It's just 2nd fret on the high E string, 1st fret on the B string, 2nd fret of the G string. Now, where would we, like if this is creating a tension, where would it be? We have to find out where D7, where D is the 5th note of a key. So what we could do is just kind of think backwards and be like, okay, if we go backwards through like a major scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the D is the 5 of a G. So after a D7, play a G major. Just sounds like a fitting end, a resolution, a resolve to what you're doing. So keeping that in mind, we're going to learn a couple more voicings of dominant 7 chords that could become more useful in a practical setting. So we're going to stick with this G. We're here to learn the 1 voicing here. Now what I want to do, I want to take that G major scale with a flat 7 and just take the 1st note, the 3rd note, and that special kind of dominant 7 note right there, and combine this into a 3-note voicing. So we have a G, a B, and a F. Now, technically, like we said at the beginning, we need that 5 too. We need a G, a B, a D, and an F to really get a G dominant 7 chord. But the beauty about guitar is sometimes you can actually imply certain notes, the 5th note being one of them. So what is a perfectly useful dominant 7 chord voicing for guitar looks just like this, and it's really easy too. 3, 2, 3. It's a really tight voicing. It's a closed voicing, which means there's no open strings helping us out. Even though in G's case we can add open strings. But I want to kind of consolidate it to just these 3 notes, because now we can move this around. So we have a G7, a G sharp 7, A7, A sharp 7, B7, C7, C sharp 7, D7. Right? A really easy one to get to. And a good way to remember this, especially if you're just getting into thinking of chords as numbers, like remember how this is like the 5 chord. A really easy way to find out where the 1 chord is from this voicing is just by going down a string, and there's your root note. Even if you just play the root note, you can already hear some of that resolve, where we've got a 7 chord, just go down a string, that happens to be the C. You don't even have to know the names of the notes. Like whatever chord this is right here, you know that down a string is where the resolution is going to be, and then you can maybe you can throw a shape on there, like a full bar chord shape, to make it sound better. You can just use this to know, okay, well this is a D7 going down, there's a G. I could just kind of like being more aware of the fretboard and where these different chords exist is only going to help your playing. And even if you just are thoughtful about it and spend a little bit of time, that stuff really adds up in the long run, right? So we've got these 2 voicings that we've kind of discovered for dominant 7 chords. I also want to add a bar chord voicing too. And again, you know, if you're having a hard time with bar chords, don't even worry about it. Just stick with the easier ones that we did. But we're going to take a G major bar chord right here, okay? Now the easiest way to make this a dominant 7 is by removing your pinky. Because what happens when you do that, right now I'm playing the 5th fret of the D string, which if we play the G major scale, that would be the 8th note, the root note. And remember, going 2 frets back, that's where your 7's going to be. So when you lift your pinky up, you're exposing your index finger's fret right here, which is the 3rd fret, which is that dominant 7 interval. So, and there's the resolution, okay? So, really easy way, if you have your bar chords down, pick that pinky up and make it a dominant 7 chord. It's just a really small alteration that can really kind of change the whole tonality of that chord. Now, something that the blues music does a lot is they'll use dominant 7 chords where maybe they're not supposed to be. Like you could turn every major chord into a dominant 7 chord, and that's something that a lot of cool blues songs do. For instance, like let's stay in the key of G, and if you watch some of the other music theory videos, you know that the 1st, 4th, and 5th notes of the scale become major chords. So G, A, B, C, D, 1, 4, 5, G, C, D, G major, C major, D major. Those chords go really well together. Now, like we said before, only that D, the 5th note, should become a dominant 7 one. But if we're playing the blues, we're breaking all the rules, right? It's a very primary understanding of the blues just to break those rules. Let's turn them all into dominant 7th chords. So let's start by just adding this one voicing where we have 3E, 2A, and 2D. Go to the C chord, to the G chord. I'm just going back from the 1 to 4, but making them both dominant 7 chords. Go to the 5. So, even though, according to the rules of the major scale, only that 5 chord should be able to be eligible for a dominant 7 chord, we can turn all of them into it and kind of start getting cool bluesy sounds just by using one voicing of it. Same thing with, we can maybe start shuffling voicings around to maybe make it a little bit more interesting. Like for that C7, let's maybe, for the C and the D, let's use that first voicing that we went to. So again, remember, we just find a C on the high E string, which is the 8th fret, go back 2, and that's going to be our C7 voicing. The D is always just 2 frets higher than a C, and then we can end it on that G. So maybe that first G, what do we use the bar chord for? Then when we go to the 4 chord, we're going to think of a C with 2 frets back. And then maybe a different voicing of G. And then go to the D, remember which we had 2, there's a D, 10th fret, back 2 frets, so we could do this one. To the C, and then a regular G, 7. So, just like we can use these voicings as different substitutions for chords, like we just did there, so going G, C, D, we went G, C, G. We can use these little pieces just as almost like little launch pads into maybe solos. Like for the G specifically, we can kind of just think of that right there in different. So anytime you find a G, root of G on the A string, that would be the 10th fret. Again, that voicing is totally movable. And then if you think of like the E minor pentatonic scale maybe, which you could start on like the 7th fret of the A string, we can kind of get into that from a G So all I did there, I just took the E minor pentatonic, which is the E is here, to a G, to an A, to a B, to a D, right? And then we can kind of jump into 7 voicing from there, into something you're more familiar with. And again, we could do that with any key. It's all movable options that you have. So basically, this is kind of like a crash course in using 7 chords, dominant 7 chords. Again, that's the most important thing. Like if you see an A7, some people think like A7, oh, is that an A major 7? No, dominant. It's almost kind of strange that they're omitting the word dominant, which is a very powerful word just to shorten the chord thing into just a letter and a number. But always know, whenever you see a letter and the number 7, that means dominant 7. And it most traditionally happens on the 5 chord, but by no means does that mean you should be limited to how you use them. So if you absolutely dominated that lesson, you learned a lot, make sure you click some of the surrounding videos, because while there's only one dominant 7 chord, there's also very, very important information to be had by clicking on any of these fine videos. So as always, please let us know what you think of it, and if you have any feedback, and hit us up in the comments, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Thanks.